I was physically in the most painful place I'd ever been. That's the closest thing to knowing what it's like to have a baby. I will never try it again. These are all quotes from athletes who, at one point or another, have held one of the most prestigious records in all of endurance sports. But the effort required to attain that record, as these quotes suggest, is just about as much as the human body and mind are capable of. Because these are world-class athletes, some of the most accomplished, disciplined, and well-conditioned sports people that have ever lived. But this one test was enough to push them all to their absolute limit, all on its own. It's not super complicated. At its core, the cycling hour record is just a test to see how far a person can bike in 60 minutes. There are longer races out there, like the Tour de France. There are more acute, short-term physical tests, like running the 800 in the Olympics. But the hour record sits right at the perfect intersection of endurance and intensity. And for that reason, plus a few others, for my money, it's probably the most demanding test of physical capacity that currently exists. This is not the kind of record that people usually attempt to break more than once. But to figure out what makes the hour so daunting, I knew I needed to talk to someone who knows this event inside and out. So I called in a bona fide journalist, even if he does usually technically cover something else. So I am admittedly doing something a little bit insane here, because I have you, Alex Hutchinson, renowned running expert here, and I'm not going to ask you that much about running.
That's okay.
Alex Hutchinson is one of the most well-known sports science writers in the world right now. His book, Endure, which I used as one of my main reference points for my 2-hour marathon episode, is recommended reading for pretty much anyone who works with athletes right now. And while, yes, he does primarily cover running, as a former competitive runner himself, his research interests extend into lots of other things too.
I guess I would call myself an endurance science journalist. I mean, I don't really call myself that, but if I was trying to paint my what I've spent the last, let's say, 10 or 15 years focusing on is the science of endurance. So I'm a runner, but I'm interested more generally in what defines the limits of endurance, and sort of exploring the physiological, the psychological, all the different factors that make it feel like we've reached our limits when we try feats of endurance.
One of those feats of endurance that Alex has studied is the hour record. He actually devoted an entire chapter to it in Endure, specifically in the context of how the hour forces the athletes who attempt it to deal with pain. This test has been around since the end of the 19th century, starting all the way back in 1893 when Henri de Grand set the record in Paris, and continuing up to 2022 when Filippo Ganna set the record at nearly 57,000 meters, or over 35 miles. But how did biking around a track for an hour become such an important, internationally recognized benchmark, to the point that some of the greatest cyclists of all time have gone out of their way to try it? Alex has spent most of his professional career studying endurance events like this, and even he isn't quite sure.
It doesn't sound all that unique or different from a billion other races, right? Like, why is cycling for an hour any harder than cycling for 30 minutes or for that matter for the Tour de France, for cycling, like 6 hours a day for 3 weeks? The half marathon is a common event, and it's a little bit more than an hour. It's like, why don't people say the half marathon in running is intolerable? And I think there's something special about the way the hour is run or biked, which is that you're on a velodrome. You're not racing against anybody. Most people, when they make an hour attempt, it's not like you against 50 people. It's you and the clock.
There are a few things that make trying to break the hour record a uniquely terrible experience, but we're going to break it down into two broad categories: the physical aspects and the mental ones. Physically, the difficulty in the hour record lies in the ability of the rider to go as fast as possible, as long as possible. Sports scientists refer to this as a cyclist's critical speed, which is actually a term that comes from mechanical engineering, but in this case refers to the absolute highest point where oxygen being delivered by the heart and lungs matches the amount being demanded by the muscles. But maintaining that balance is about as challenging as it is important.
Once you're above critical speed, you're kind of living in you're on borrowed time, because you're not able to pay your metabolic bills fast enough, so the clock is running as to when you're going to have to stop.
But to set the hour record, you have to keep that speed going for about as long as possible, which, not coincidentally, is about 60 minutes for well-conditioned athletes. For an entire hour, you have to put out as much power as you can, while also walking a physiological tightrope that you simply cannot afford to fall off in either direction. Too slow and the record starts slipping away. Too fast? Well, let's just say you don't want to go too fast. The effort required to maintain that pace for that long is, of course, excruciating. It's where most of the pain that so many who have attempted the hour talk about comes from. Riding that fast for that long also creates a lot of heat, especially on an indoor track. So much so that riders like Dan Bigham and Filippo Ganna put away pounds of what they call slush to both fuel and cool their bodies down beforehand. There's not much room for physical variance either. In a road race, you have shifts in elevation, terrain, or temperature that can give you a little bit of relief as you adjust to them. Those adjustments work like rotating the tires on your car. Anything you can do to limit the wear and tear on one part of your body can make a big difference in a long endurance race. But in the hour, there's not really any room for anything like that. Maintaining critical speed for that long requires total commitment to every aspect of the physical effort required to reach it. That includes staying in the aerodynamic position, which isn't super comfortable to get into without having to also pedal as hard as you can for essentially the entire hour. The pain and discomfort are part of the deal, and attempting the hour record means that you've accepted that being your reality until the hour is over.
Anytime you let yourself relax in a race that's at critical threshold or higher, you're going to be slowing down and you're going to be losing time. So you can't afford to just get into that relaxed zone.
It was so interesting reading it through your chapter of like this idea of like the metabolites accumulating over like a longer race and sort of like cooking you like a sous vide. It's kind of terrifying. But then you also have again that just like accumulation effects and a shorter effort too.
Would you rather be fried or boiled? That's your question.
It's a good line. I can put that in the video.
If you were trying to come up with a controlled experiment to figure out the limit of how much power a person could put out over an extended period of time, it would probably look a lot like the hour record. It's as perfect and simple as it is terrible, because it eliminates as many variables as possible until the only thing that's really left is what your body is capable of doing. But if that's the case, and this really just is a glorified lab experiment, then why doesn't the person with the biggest VO2 max or highest performance and other big physiological markers have the hour record by default? The answer to that is pretty simple. There's a lot more to this than just a reading on a power meter, which technically you're not allowed to use, but you get the point. The hour record is demanding physically, of course, but it's also an absolutely brutal test of what your mind is capable of too, both in terms of concentration and your ability to deal with pain. Normally, if you're doing something like riding a bike or going for a run, even if the effort is hard, there are things around you that you can react to or change to break up the monotony. There may be landmarks you reach along the path that can serve as motivation, or there may be a breeze blowing past that can give you a little lift as you go. Heck, half the reason I go out and run at all is to see people out with their dogs. But in the hour record, there's basically none of that sort of thing, especially dogs. You're going really fast for a really long time, but you're in a loop, so you're not actually really going anywhere. This creates what I like to call the hamster wheel effect, and as much as anything else, that monotony is one of the biggest challenges that anyone attempting the hour record is going to have to overcome.
There is nothing going on in your world other than pedaling that bike. There's no crowds, you're not going by any scenery, you're going round and round a tiny little track and you're pedaling, and there is nothing to distract you. Why is it easier to run a marathon in New York City than it is around the block of your neighborhood? Well, in New York City, there's a lot going on. There's people cheering, you're seeing things. On the hour, there's nothing. There's absolutely nothing but your pain. And you can't do anything but focus on your pain. And you can't relax or chill out, because to do your best, you have to stay right up at your critical speed, right up at that zone that doesn't feel like you can sustain it unless you overcome that urge.
Being able to stay in the zone that Alex is describing is obviously extremely difficult physically, but it also requires a tremendous amount of concentration, which will in turn only make the physical stuff that much harder. Especially in an environment where there's so little external stimulus to react to, your brain is spending a lot of energy maintaining the focus required to keep pushing yourself as hard as you need to break the record. There are evidence-based training programs, like the one designed by Dr. Samuel Marcora, that are designed to enhance an athlete's ability to deal with that mental fatigue. But as Alex found out the hard way, they kind of suck.
I was amazed at how hard it was. Like the first time I tried it, these researchers were like, okay, we'll help you prepare for a marathon. So go and do this at home. And I was like, okay, I did it for 5 minutes. Is that good? And they're like, because it felt like an eternity. And they're like, yeah, 5 minutes at the start, but you should try to get up to 90 minutes. Are you kidding me? I can't think of anything I would rather do again in my life than sit at my computer and have to focus that hard for that long. And I'll tell you, you're exhausted by the end of sitting there for an hour. And then I would go out and try and do my run, and I'd feel like crap. So it's, and that the hour, that's the definition of the hour. Every pedal stroke you're having to focus on.
And with every stroke of those pedals, the legs and lungs are sending back a very clear sensory message to the brain. We are not having a great time down here, dude. Even for the most elite endurance athletes on Earth, pain is part of the deal when it comes to an event like this. There are a lot of definitions for what pain and discomfort actually mean in this kind of context, and I genuinely do not have time to try and get into them here, but for our purposes, what you need to understand about pain is that it's unique to every person that experiences it, and that it's just as much about the mental and emotional experiences that come along with it as it is the physical ones. Dealing with it in something like the hour is going to come down to how those signals are interpreted, and how well you've conditioned your mind to process them as they inevitably come along.
The same level of nerve impulse going to your brain might be interpreted as imminent catastrophe for someone who's just, trying to train for their first 5K. They think they're going to die. And because they've never felt this or haven't felt it in 20 years or whatever, they view it as very, very distressing, that they can't breathe, like they're going to die, versus someone who's been training like that every day for the last 15 years. It's just like, this is just information. This is not distressing at all. This is telling me at what level I'm exercising and that I can maintain this pace probably for 5 more minutes, but not for 7 more minutes. Is this good? Is this bad? So it's misleading to say pain is all in the head, but pain is mediated by what's going on in your brain and by the context and by your own experiences.
Yeah, and in that chapter you mentioned how if somebody is an amputee and you can still have that sort of phantom limb pain, and in my world, if I'm somebody who's if I'm on the autism spectrum and I have significant sensitivity to things like light or sound, those, if I take that person to a concert, that can be painful. That's part of their you mentioned their interoception, their body telling them, hey, this is painful, we need to get out of here. That's just as real as somebody who gets their leg snapped in half. So that complicates all of this, to be able to sort of pin this down.
Yeah, I mean, it gets frustrating, as an athlete, because then you're okay, you take this information on your board and you're okay, so pain is all in my head. It's all how I respond to, it's like the second arrow in Buddhism, or it's there's the physical thing, but then there's your response to it that matters. But then you get in the middle of the hour race, and you try telling yourself that it's okay, the pain is just in my head, it's all just how I interpret it, and that doesn't make it go away.
This is the main reason why I think the hour record might be the hardest thing to attempt in sports. Everyone knows how awful it is. They know how much it demands of you, and how much more they're going to have to commit to it every time the record gets broken, and then they do it anyway. There's such a small target to hit here to be successful, and there's such a tremendous price to be paid to even try. But it has to be worth it at some level, or people wouldn't keep doing it. The hour has gone through a series of technological rule changes and a host of new record holders over the years, but at its core, it's still the same test that people have been doing since the 1800s. Both physically and mentally, its brutality lies in its simplicity, and the pretty much universally understood fact that in order to go further than anyone else has gone before, you're going to have to leave a pretty significant chunk of your soul behind you. There are longer tests, there are more demanding tests. But when it comes to finding the athlete with the best combination of physical capacity and intestinal fortitude, in my mind, the hour remains undefeated. Hi everyone, I'm Will, and this is my channel, Student of the Game, where we talk about sports psychology and culture, and sometimes cycling. I have to give a huge thank you to Alex Hutchinson, who is genuinely one of my favorite people to read about this kind of stuff, and I'm so glad that I got to interview him for an episode. That was definitely one of those emails where I didn't expect the person to respond, but Alex did, and we're all a little smarter for it. I'll leave a link to some of his writing in the episode description, but if you enjoyed the episode, please do give it a like and subscribe to the channel for more stuff like it. Can't guarantee that all of the episodes will be this informative, but I can at least promise to give it my best shot. There's a link to the Patreon in the episode notes if you want to help us keep going strong. But to wrap this one up, I'm Will, and this is Student of the Game. See you next time.